Welcome everyone to the TU College of Law. My name is Janet Levitt, and I'm very pleased to introduce the third of our Faculty Showcase Series CLE programs. The first was, the kickoff was Professor Rex Zadalis, who talked about Iraqi oil contracts. The second was Professor Robert Spoo, who spoke about copyright fair use, particularly his experience with the James Joyce estate. And we are very pleased to hear today from one of our newest professors, Carrie Griffin Basas. Before I introduce Carrie, I just want to let everyone know that we are going to send around a sheet to get email addresses. We really are trying to go green, so we're trying to cut down on the amount of paper we send out, and it would be really helpful if we could just get a list so we can inform you. We plan to have these Faculty Showcase series about 3 times a semester, and so we want to make sure that everyone is notified of when they occur. So our speaker today, Carrie Griffin Basas, joined us in she arrived in Tulsa in May of this year. She has a really distinguished background. Did her undergraduate degree at Swarthmore College, her law degree at Harvard Law School. Before becoming a law professor, she was very involved in disability rights advocacy. She founded a nonprofit called Higher Abilities, which was a national organization dedicated to empowering emerging professionals with disabilities. She's also worked with many organizations and also private companies and corporations on advising on disability rights and disability law, and she was just appointed to be a commissioner of the ABA's Commission on Physical and Mental Disability Law. She teaches here professional responsibility, criminal law. She will be teaching constitutional law and a disability rights seminar. And we are so pleased to have her in Tulsa and as a member of our faculty, so let's welcome Carrie Basas.
Thanks so much. Thanks for coming out today. It gives me a great opportunity to share a work in progress that I have, and I'd love to get your feedback. What I'm going to talk to you today is about a study that I did. It's the first of its kind that I'm aware of in the nation. It's an empirical study of the experiences of disabled women who are lawyers. And it was a qualitative study, and I'll show you the survey and the methods that I used for this. And if you want, later on, there's a copy available on ssrn.com, and if you just search for my last name, you'll find it, and we can make the link available to you too. So it's a pretty long paper, but I'm just going to give you a slice of it today. And it's great that we're talking about people with disabilities today because, as it turns out, it's the UN's International Day of Disabled People. And so you may have heard that the UN recently had a Human Rights Convention on the rights of people with disabilities, and the U.S. hasn't signed it, but the rest of the world is getting involved with this, and so it's really a good time to talk about that. And I want to situate this study in a larger context. About 90% of people with disabilities in developing nations are unemployed. And within our own country, the estimate, and other industrialized nations, the estimate is 60 to 75%. And when people with disabilities are employed, what we know is that they're employed at lower sectors of the professions and in the economy. So sometimes they're unemployed, sometimes they're underemployed, so not employed at the level of skill that they have. And I've become really interested in this issue in the legal profession because we know that women in the legal profession have really struggled, and as have other minority groups. And I think about people with disabilities as a cultural minority group. And so I was interested in figuring out what their experiences were like. And I was realizing as I was going and doing some research that people really hadn't studied this experience, and we didn't have a whole lot of data on it. So I'm going to share what we do know about the profession and walk you through that. But first I want to open with a couple quotes from the women I talked to. One of them, from Jo, talked about how she expected to find another job fairly quickly, But one of the barriers she encountered as a woman who is a lawyer and has a disability was that employers were worried that she might sue. And so she had a really hard time transitioning to a new job. And that's a pattern that I saw in the study that I conducted, that many of the women attorneys had some hard times moving out of the position that they got, and they had a hard time getting that position in the beginning. And other women, and this was another theme in the study, didn't really survive at large law firms. And so Crystal talked about how she was at a large law firm in San Francisco. She worked there for a year and a half, and she was terminated for allegedly poor performance. The reason she thinks she was terminated was she didn't disclose her disability when she was first hired, and then it came out later. And that's actually some advice that we give students with disabilities who are law students. We often tell them not to disclose your disability because there's so much stigma about it. But the employer was very upset that she didn't disclose and felt like they should have had that information. Maybe they wouldn't have hired her. So that feeds into some of the stigma about disability that we see and some reactions by employers to finding out about disability. So here's what we know already about the legal profession and women and people with disabilities in it. So about a third of all attorneys are women, about 44 to 50% of all law students are women. But no specific survey, as I was mentioning, has been designed to capture their experiences of attorneys with disabilities, and especially broken down by gender. So we know, so we've sort of patched together some figures. We know from the American Community Survey that about 6% of all legal professionals have a disability, but that's a legal professional. We're not really sure how it's being defined. It could be an administrative assistant, it could be a paralegal, it could be a temp of some kind, and the census gives us a figure that's about 10%. So a fraction of that will be attorneys, and it's hard for us to kind of figure this out. But we know, stepping back, what we know about women who are at firms, only about 6% of them are in managing partner roles, and that women of color who are attorneys, compared to non-women of color, or women who are not of color, there's a difference too. The numbers get even smaller for higher-ranked partnerships, so 3% and 1.4%. So we know that if you bring in another minority experience, in addition to being a woman lawyer, that this really can have an effect on your retention and promotion at firms. So what we do know is when we're looking at this legal professionals number, that a lot of them are paralegals. For my nonprofit work, I talked to many attorneys with disabilities who were told that maybe they should try to shoot for something less than their JD. So they went to the vocational rehabilitation system, and this was across the country, so this is not necessarily representative of Oklahoma. But they went to, meet with their friendly vocational rehabilitation counselor, and many of those people are wonderful. But some of them were told, well, you have a JD, or you're thinking about going to law school. Maybe you should be a legal secretary. Maybe you should be a paralegal. It might be easier for you to get a job there. And so people with disabilities have been discouraged from going through law school. And the ones who do go through law school report having a really hard time finding a job. And a competitive job with it when you think about their peers. Well, we know disability is not a rare thing in the law. In fact, many of us are living with disabilities that we don't disclose to one another. In the law, we see a prevalence of addiction, learning disabilities, mental health concerns. Many of those things are exacerbated by the kind of work we do and the stresses we're under. And so, but many people live with those disabilities and don't really talk about them as much. So I was saying that the major organizations don't really study disability, the experiences of lawyers with disabilities. The ABA's Commission on Mental and Physical Disability Law has been making inroads. They have a limited study in which they do a survey of section chairs and program chairs to find out how many people with disabilities they think they have in their section. But then you need to know those people pretty well, and their disabilities have to be obvious. So I'll show you some of the numbers. They're pretty low. A friend in San Francisco who does employment law work tried to create a conference, and she did. She was successful with that, of lawyers with disabilities in the Bay Area. And she found, after contacting the Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Justice Department, the Census Bureau, that people were not collecting statistics on lawyers with disabilities. So we know even less about how it breaks down along gender experiences. So what the ABA has found that a third of 1% of ABA members have identified as having disabilities. Now, out of 140,000 law students, about 3,500 of them have requested accommodations. This is reporting, so we don't really think it captures all the numbers. But we do know that accommodations or requests are going up in law schools, and that's because we have a lot more students who are coming out about their disabilities, and a lot more students who are coming to the system who had accommodations in undergrad and maybe have learning disabilities. So we also see that the leadership of the various sections and programs into the ABA is kind of dismal when looked at the number. 0.2% of those positions are held by lawyers with disabilities. And the ABA, through its commission, just developed a directory of law schools and their disability resources for students. But the irony is that the ABA's website is completely inaccessible, and their plan to make it accessible is going to take some time. And when I asked them, why aren't you adding the new content as accessible content, they said, well, we're going to go back and integrate it all. But in the meantime, somebody's using a screen reader, some sort of adaptive software to access the ABA website. They can't make it accessible to themselves to look at this directory. So it, only deals with certain kinds of disabilities, and it's not representative of all the needs that we see. So so now did a survey too, and found that about 78% of law graduates with disabilities were employed. And their mean salary is lower, and about half of them took jobs in private practice. So, and the State Bar of California has been really good and been a leader in this area in doing more surveys. And they are setting a trend. Arizona, Florida, and some other states are moving in this direction of trying to figure out in their membership who has disabilities. And so it's something to encourage at the local and state bar level, because they may be best able to access and know about their membership and what sort of disabilities are present. So, and that we see that about half of people with disabilities who are going after legal jobs have been denied employment, and they think that's because of their disabilities. So I was interested in figuring out what this missing gender factor was. I knew from studying disability rights that women with disabilities are more likely to be unemployed, to live in a poverty level, and to experience stigma and discrimination in a way that men with disabilities do not to the same levels, although they're experiencing a lot of discrimination too. So I was interested in seeing what this overlap between disability and gender was as I went through it. So I talked to 39 women with disabilities around the country through a qualitative survey, which I'll show you those questions. And it was cross-disability, so anybody who self-identified as having a disability. In fact, one of the questions I asked was, how do you define disability? And I got a wide variety of answers. And some people used the Americans with Disabilities Act definition, and other people had more fluid definitions, and many of them had multiple disabilities. So it took about a year to conduct the study. I did surveys, did some follow-up interviews, and the questions were qualitative and open-ended, and I just really wanted to know about their experiences in law school and in employment. So here are the topics I looked at, basic demographic information, stuff about their law school experiences, stuff about getting into the workforce and staying there, and anything else they want to tell me about their lives and their experiences in the community and how and if they were integrated as community members. So I just wanted, and I'll move through these pretty quickly. I just wanted to give you some idea of the breakdown, what I was asking. People were very generous with information, and before I sent around these questions, I vetted them with some professors of psychology and sociology and anthropology, as well as some attorneys with disabilities, to make sure that I was asking the right questions, that it wasn't too burdensome in terms of length. And I got some really good feedback from that, from testing the survey in advance. So I asked about disability, and like I said, the effects it had on work and community and at home. And many of those things were interrelated, I found. And then law school experiences. So here I was really interested in knowing what were your experiences with the law school in general? Did you see other people with disabilities around? Was there any sort of community based on that? Did you even want a community based on that? What were your experiences with non-disabled people at law school like? And out of that, I got some really interesting information that many people were reluctant to come out as having disabilities if they could keep it more private, because they were concerned that their classmates or professors would think they were getting an advantage if they got an accommodation of some kind. So like time and a half for a task if you have a learning disability. So people were really uncomfortable. And that happens with my own students. I mean, I never, unless it's really obvious, I never know if my students have a disability, but over the course of the semester, through something else, they may come and mention it to me. But they may not have told many other people in the building. They may have, spoken to Vicki Lemus, he had an accommodation, but they're not going around necessarily advertising that. And they wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable maybe joining an association or group of law students with disabilities. So employment, I really want to know, what were the barriers to employment that they had? Was it hard getting an initial job? And then was it hard getting promoted as they went up? And, do they feel like their careers were as successful? Do they get where they wanted to go as other people? And were they satisfied in their jobs? And then all kinds of questions about their identity. So many of them didn't identify as, say, disability advocates, or even as a person with a disability. I had some people say, well, technically I have a disability, but I don't really move in those circles, and I really pulled myself up by my own bootstraps, and so I'm not really sure if I should fill out this survey. Like, I meet the ADA definition, I've gotten accommodations, but, I don't feel disabled. And so there's an interesting surveys and interviews to conduct, because I got a lot of information about stigma and reluctance to identify as having a disability, and how that's reinforced by our profession. We emphasize people having these sort of superhuman qualities. No one is ever sick, no one's ever late, no one ever has a typo, no one is ever in a bad mood. No one ever has weird or erratic behavior. I can tell you none of that is true, right? So, the jokes they made, and this was an inappropriate joke, a couple of years ago at the American Association of Law Schools, was welcome to the asylum, because you have to figure out when you're hired by some place where you fit in, and we all, whether or not we have a disability, go into a unique work culture, and we need to figure out what is our role there. Poor Lynn in the back. Anyway, thanks for laughing. But, it's really offensive to people who have mental health concerns to say welcome to the asylum, and to, mock that there is a real experience of living with a disability and there's stigma. But it's true that any of us who go into workplaces have these expectations, and you know what our profession is like, and especially as you get closer to the end of the year and the billable hour limit. Or expectations that you need to exceed. And it's true, government is even going more in that direction. So there are many pressures, and sometimes those things don't emphasize balance or health or wellness, and especially, acknowledging any sort of personal weaknesses or differences or diversity of any kind. So there's a lot of stress for people to keep quiet about things that are bothering them. So I ended up talking to recent graduates, within a few months, practicing, to women in their 60s, and some of them had been out for 30 years. It was geographically diverse all across the country, different school backgrounds from Tier 1 down to Tier 4, and a range of professional interests and disabilities as well. And there was diversity in race and sexual orientation. There were some people missing out of this study, and it's, an interesting question to take up later, but I was happy to see that it sort of at least got some different voices, and even if it's not fully representative. So, like I was saying, they worked in all kinds of sectors: government, nonprofit, private practice, although private practice was mostly smaller firms. And that was true the longer somebody was in their profession. So a lot of women who started out at large firms saw the writing on the wall and thought, I'm not going to make partner here. Some people in the office aren't giving me work to do. I need to go somewhere else. So some of them became entrepreneurs and solo practitioners because, and I'll talk about that in a minute, that added some flexibility. Even though there were demands, obviously, in running your own business, it also gives you an opportunity to create your own schedule in some ways and control the kind of work. And you can alter that to your energy level, your health needs, appointments you may have, or assistance you may get. It takes a while, and it's really, you need to have some startup capital, as you know, to do that. But some women just found that that was a better situation than going into an existing law firm. So 4 women were unemployed, and they were either, some of them were studying, some were in the process of starting a business but hadn't really brought in income. 3 of them were part-time. I realize the numbers don't always add up to 39. What we're doing is taking this qualitative information, then trying to extrapolate from it, and there's some overlap between categories you'll see. So there are a number of women in disability rights work, and a number of women in nonprofits and legal aid, and then a number of women in government, and fewer women in teaching and academia. And I should say the women who were in teaching and academia were not in tenure-track positions for the most part. They were teaching part-time, teaching as or working as administrators in student services, those kinds of roles. Here's just a sampling of what the women look like in terms of their identities. We really didn't have, the most common minority background was African American, it was Latina, Hispanic, and the least common was African American. I didn't have anyone participate who identified as being Asian, Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern. 9 women identified as being lesbian or bisexual. Here are some of the disabilities. It's kind of a long list. I should tell you that the most common disability was blindness, and the least common disabilities were bipolar disorder, spina bifida, cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis. We didn't have anybody participate who identified as having a speech disorder, dwarfism, or was living with HIV or AIDS. So the kinds of accommodations requested were pretty across the board too. We're talking about speech-based computer programs like Dragon Naturally Speaking, speakerphones, braille printers, magnification, readers, assistants of some kind. There was a real emphasis on flexible schedules. That seemed to be the most, having some flexibility at work seemed to be the most important thing for people being successful at work and being retained and feeling like they fit in the work environment. And then some people needed some special or adapted physical spaces or offices, different office furniture. Other things falling into flexibility included telecommuting, working from home, and then having more control over their own appointments and scheduling in that way. One of the hardest accommodations for a woman to get in the study, a neurological disability, was finding some place without fluorescent lighting. So this is her campaign now, and you have to think about it. It's hard. Everywhere we go, we have fluorescent lighting. And she was doing court mediations. And she really was trying to just get a room where she could have an incandescent light bulb, because she gets seizures and she gets disoriented when she has fluorescent lighting. And that was a big deal to a court to have to come up with a room where they would change the light bulbs. And the environmentalists, everybody, and I'm an environmentalist, we want fluorescent light bulbs, it's better, it's more energy efficient, but meanwhile it's causing and exacerbating other people's neurological disabilities. So we're going to be moving more towards a fluorescent world, which is going to make it more difficult for her to find employment. Ultimately, she's becoming an entrepreneur. She's doing a virtual law office online and building that out of North Carolina. So she's hoping that she can get some grants and provide some free services to people with disabilities, but also have like a small wills and estates domestic relations practice. So, and I discovered through the study, and this is the thing I would emphasize with you today, is that many of the women were self-accommodating at work. They knew about the ADA. Some of them, that's the statute they use most in their line of work if they're doing disability rights. But they weren't necessarily requesting accommodations, even if they needed them. They were finding a way to deal with it at work without making an issue for someone else. And we can talk about why they were doing that. This is kind of small, but I just wanted to say that, the biggest problem there with accommodations was a lack of willingness to accommodate. There were some strange requests that employers made, and there was one attorney who talked about how her employer didn't want her going to court because it wouldn't look good to have somebody with a disability show up. It sort of erodes your position and image of authority to have somebody who obviously has a health problem, who's weak in some way, show up. So that was strange, but really it was just going up against a wall with employers. And the interesting thing is that, we've had the ADA since 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act. You're supposed to get reasonable accommodations. Some of the women who had been practicing longer said, people are more willing to give me accommodations before the ADA. It's the ADA, they said, now, this is anecdotal for them, that is causing some resistance because employers see me, they see a disability, or I come out about my disability, and they think I'm going to sue. And that I'm going to be costly. Whereas before, some of these older attorneys said, people did it out of the generosity of their hearts. It wasn't charity, it wasn't pity necessarily, they didn't perceive it that way. They just said, this is the right thing to do and I'm going to do it, no statute is making me do it, I'm not going to get smacked, I can decide how far I'm willing to go. The ADA calls for an interactive process which should make accommodations more fair to employers and employees in theory, but people are not engaging in that process. And many of the women said, I'm not going to sue. I need this job. If they hire me, which is a really hard thing for people to find jobs, if I get hired, I'm just going to do whatever I need to do to make it work, even if that means taking money out of my pocket to pay for my accommodations, even if that means hiding my needs in the workplace so nobody else asks, well, why is it that it's taking you longer? So even if it means, cutting down those billable hours because it took me longer, or it means paying for my own taxis to go between appointments, I'll do that. And the biggest thing really that the women talked about consistently was attitudinal barriers. It wasn't, a 36-inch doorway, although that's helpful, and we have made progress in physical environments. It was attitudinal barriers, and it was barriers related to cost. And we know that accommodations, most of them do not cost that much, but there's been a lot of fear that they will. And many of these women were perfectly reasonable. I think all of them were reasonable from the ones I talked to, but were willing to engage in some process in which they wanted to be fair to their employers. The last thing they wanted to do was lose their jobs over having a disability, and that's why some of them took it off the table entirely and said, you don't have to do anything for me. I'm not going to be special. I'm not going to ask for anything else. In fact, I'm going to try to be a model employee because I want to cover my butt, make sure that I'm not fired. I don't give anybody a reason to fire me. So, and the women consistently talked about little support and feedback from their schools. Schools were telling them, don't talk to anybody about your disability. Let them hire you. And then later on, if it becomes an issue, or you decide you feel comfortable, you can tell someone then. But don't tell them about it now, because that's too much for a hiring partner or an interviewer, if you have a choice. And people who did have visible disabilities and were going into interviews, I know I had problems in law school with that, just people feeling really uncomfortable. It's not something that necessarily the schools have been emphasizing in terms of their diversity programs. We're doing a good job of that here at Tulsa, but it may not be something that appears in the literature about, we have students who have disabilities too, and that this can be a minority experience for people, and people with disabilities face discrimination, and they should be part of your outreach efforts. In fact, this whole study started because my original idea was to survey the Vault top 100 firms and give them a survey about their diversity hiring practices and ask about disability questions. I want to know, do they have people with disabilities who are taking out the trash? And do they have people with disabilities who are managing partners? And so all the way in between. And I distributed these surveys, and I was at the University of Virginia, and 2 firms filled them out, and even after harassing them. And they were anonymous and confidential, and they filled them out, and I was going to talk about the results in the aggregate, and it was quantitative. It probably took about 5 minutes if you had the information. But they're not tracking the information. They don't know how many people with disabilities they have. And law schools don't know either a lot of times. I mean, they can tell you how many students have requested accommodations. The ABA doesn't really know because of its surveying system. So we just don't know. And nobody's ever really emphasized that this should be something you're tracking. And so it's slowly going in that direction. But I had other law firms write back, or I called them and I said, we can't really talk about that. So I thought maybe they're not doing well on this front. And it's not, the couple who did fill it out said it took them a while because they didn't know where the data was. Many of them had received diversity awards or awards for being really good employers for women, and really good having good employee benefits and flexibility at work, lifestyle firms. And, they said, well, there's somebody in the office who's 85 years old and has a cane, but I'm not sure if politically he would identify with the disability rights movement. So maybe I can check off the box for him, but maybe not. So it just really has been very complicated, and nobody was really willing to identify a point of contact with the firm who would handle disability issues, and it just makes me think that that's another reason they're not seeing and not hiring people with disabilities. And a lot of students are getting information not to go to firms. A lot of disabled students. So when I ran a mentoring program through my nonprofit, some of the attorneys in the program were happily ensconced in their government jobs. And being a government attorney is great. I mean, it's a public service. And I'd be the last person to discourage my students from doing it. But, I worked at the Justice Department for summer in the disability rights section, and it really was a disability ghetto. It's where all the attorneys with disabilities are. I don't know if anybody watches South Park or has kids or something. There's this great episode, and that was stuck in my mind, is the island of the misfit mascots, right? And so I think law firms are like the island of the misfit mascots, because there's sort of all the rejected mascots, different people, different personalities. So this island of the misfit mascots is everybody's a little different. That's what the world is. And so I think it's a beautiful metaphor, but the Justice Department disability rights section is a disability ghetto. All people with disabilities. And some of them want to be there, but if you talk to people, and this is true for some legal aid organizations and protection and advocacy groups, you talk to people, there's a good percentage of people who want to be there. Some of them want to be there because they experience discrimination, and they want to help other people. Some of them, have had an interest in it all their lives, and for some of them, that's the best job they got. And they didn't feel like they could move on. And the number of people I talked to there, which is another reason it sparked the study, had said they were at firms, and they weren't going to make it any further at the firm. And so year 4 or 5 came, and they decided to get out before they were embarrassed or without a job. So, it's interesting to see what fuels people's career choices, but I'm just interested in people having career choices. And, if we have a higher concentration of, disabled attorneys and disability rights, that's fine. Or, people who have people with disabilities in their families who want to work in disability rights, that's fine as long as it's a choice. But many of these women said there really wasn't much choice for them, and they got funneled towards these kinds of jobs. So, I realize this is not an uplifting presentation, but I should say that some of the women had really good experiences at work. And for the most part, they were women who had more flexible work environments. There's this woman, Sherry, in the Midwest, who said she's been very lucky. She's never had any barriers finding a job, and all of her employers have been amenable to any reasonable accommodations she's asked for. She's all the women who participated were just so talented and different with their experiences and their stories. But, I think that from looking at Sherry's story and the context for it, she had a really good network, too. She knew other attorneys or attorneys in the family. She was in this community where people had grown up with her and she had a disability. They felt comfortable. And that made it easier, I think, for her. And she has a really positive attitude. And I think that made it easier for her to find a job and be successful in a job, having that kind of support network. So what we find, as I was mentioning, is that we have self-accommodation going on at the workplace for women with disabilities who are lawyers. We have entrepreneurs in self-employment. There are many stories about feeling isolated and marginalized, and that happens on a social level too. Some of the women were telling me that they went to bar events and no one talked to them. And one woman I interviewed was Caribbean. She said she went to Caribbean bar events and she thought, finally, I'm with other Caribbean people and somebody will talk to me, because when I'm at work and I'm in my wheelchair, nobody wants to talk to me. People feel uncomfortable, even though part of the practice at the place she was involved disability law. It's sort of ironic. We do disability law but we don't want to talk to the person with a disability. So she said that, and she was really, she was one of the people I interviewed by phone initially. We talked for hours, and she was wonderful and just so friendly, and so it was really hard to hear how isolated she was at work. So she said she went to the Caribbean Bar Association, thinking she would make friends there, it'd be sort of a homecoming. And the people there were really uncomfortable with her wheelchair too. And so she said, I don't know where the hell I have to go to feel comfortable, but I haven't found it yet. And nobody accepts me. She said she said there felt like there's so much stigma around disability in her workplace and then at the Caribbean Bar Association that she didn't know where to go to have some sort of homecoming or sense of compatibility and acceptance. So, and some of the lawyers were talking about how their disability, even if it wasn't something that affected them daily in their work, became such a big thing to other people at work. And it was the thing they talked about all the time. And that contributed to some difficulty finding workplace fit. So, I was thinking about the study and what the women had to say, and I was thinking that there's a lot of overlap with clients. And in fact, some of the women talked about having clients with disabilities. We have this that comes up in working with different clients and maybe not knowing how to respond or characterize their life experiences. So it's this discomfort. And I think there can be an assumption sometimes with clients with disabilities that you're going to have to go beyond your normal or routine approach to dealing with clients. And I think that clients with disabilities can be sensitive to this too, that they're navigating you feeling comfortable with them as they're also interviewing you to be their legal professional. So these stigma and stereotypes, are at play all the time. And as I mentioned, that some of the women said that their colleagues were better at dealing with disabled clients than they were with other disabled attorneys, which was kind of ironic, but I think it feeds back into the expectations we may have about lawyers and what they're supposed to do and what they're supposed to look like and be like. And this goes back to law school and, issues about exclusion there. It happens pretty early. Ruth, the attorney who started her virtual law firm, she says that her employment professor said in her class, her employment discrimination class about the ADA, can you believe it? They even give a break for people who have a fake disability. And she has a disability that's not obvious on the surface. And she felt like in that moment, it really didn't matter what else was said, that not only her professional interests, but her personal experiences were just discounted. And she felt excluded in that environment and felt like her only choice at that point really was, and from other experiences at the law school, and she was an advocate there and started a group for students with disabilities and did university-wide disability awareness training, and she really was a mover and a shaker, but she felt like she didn't have somebody who got her in the employment discrimination class, who understood what it was like to try to find a job and work in law school with the limitations or impairments that she had. So what I saw overall in the surveys were that women were missing from partnership and judges' ranks. I didn't reach those women. I tried to make some inroads there. Maybe there are, and I have to believe that there are women with disabilities who are working in those positions, but some of them may not want to identify or may not be in those groups of communication or channels of communication that I reached. The women are saying consistently, even if, whether or not they tried the law firms or not, they didn't think the big law firms, the national, international law firms, were viable options for them. They didn't really see them doing anything to recruit people with disabilities. And from, hearing from alumni and other people who had gone before them in the job market, they felt that there wouldn't be flexible workplaces. And there was also some frustration that they had gone through the experience of discrimination, sometimes on their own, and their individual experiences were so particular that they didn't necessarily map onto somebody else's. And they're so busy with work, they may not have had time for mentoring. And they felt like that was also given back to them. They had a really hard time finding people who were willing to talk to them candidly, who either were allies of people with disabilities, who were sensitive to the needs of people with disabilities, or were people with disabilities themselves. So there's this idea of, I succeeded, and we see this in other other student A's too, I've succeeded, and maybe I no longer identify with that experience of discrimination, or I don't want to go back and revisit it, even if it's still happening in different ways. This is not me. You know, when you ask your people in the study to pick a pseudonym, they really should, and it shouldn't be the author's name. So it's not my friend. This is someone else who's a mental health advocate, and she said that she kind of gets penalized for having a disability in her work, even though it's about disability. She said, you know, she's a mental health advocate, and her focus on mental health gets characterized by her colleagues who are doing the same kind of work as too touchy-feely. She has too much of a personal interest in it. She can't be objective. She can't be a good lawyer. And they're doing the same kind of work. She said some of them probably have mental health issues too, and were drawn to the work, or have family members, and are just not saying it because they don't want to get labeled as being too soft or too touchy-feely. So all of these issues about disability fit into the ABA's Goal 3, which is about diversity. It used to be Goal 9. And so basically the ABA is moving in the direction, it hasn't gotten there yet, of trying to implement some of these things. And I think it comes down to tracking, figuring out how big is the population, what does it look like. It was hard for me to know how successful I was in my surveying in terms of reaching different groups because I didn't know who's in the group. And when I've exhausted it, you know, a number of women who participated said, when you said you wanted to interview between 30 and 50 women with disabilities, I was wondering, who are working as attorneys in the U.S., I was wondering, are there that many of us out there? And so some of them had never met other attorneys with disabilities, and some of them had never met any other women attorneys with disabilities. And so I hope that one branch of this project will be connecting them in some way if they want to be connected. I don't want to force self-help or, you know, community on people. But some of them really were interested in knowing what the other women had experienced, and it just helps to know that it isn't your experience in isolation. So, and then you just need to be more support for people as they reveal their disability or discuss it, and really an open discussion about stigma. So, Mary, one of the people who participated, who's hard of hearing, works in academia as an administrator. She self-accommodates all the time. Not even all the people in her family know she has a disability, and she's had it for a very long time. And she said that what she does is she goes to meetings, she sits in the front row. She pretends as if she hears parts of the conversation, because she doesn't want anyone to see her as being weak, because she already feels like she's weak and at a disadvantage in our profession. And she's an older woman, you know, in terms of the study demographic. And she said she just doesn't want to draw attention to what she perceives and feels like other people would perceive, whether it's fair to them or not, as her shortcomings. So she doesn't want to be fired, she doesn't want to be demoted, and she certainly doesn't want to be pitied, so she doesn't want anyone to know. And it's amazing to think about living with this kind of secret at home, too. She said with, like, her teenagers, she tries not to let them know that she can't hear them when they yell across the house, like, you suck, Mom, or whatever it is. You know, this back and forth, and she doesn't know half of what's going on with it. And so to keep that. And so from discussing things with her and with other women, you know, we sort of came up with some of these barriers there are to entry into the profession. Barriers at the law school level in terms of supporting students with disabilities. Barriers with employers. I mean, because employers need some more education about this. They need to be able to speak candidly to other employers about their experiences with people with disabilities. So we see some surveying, not in the legal profession, but in other professions that say, if you hire a person with a disability, you're likely to have a successful experience and to feel more open to hiring other people with disabilities after that. So it's an initial barrier or hurdle to overcome. Bar admission, there's been a lot of secrecy about what accommodations are being granted for the bar. That could be a whole other talk about the ethics of accommodating students with disabilities as they move forward to the bar. But some of the states don't want to talk about how many students they're accommodating each year, what they're doing. And you know, presumably, we're not asking for a release of individual applications, so presumably that's because they're concerned that in some way they'll be giving people ideas for accommodations or showing you can get this, but you can't get that. So there's been some reluctance there on the part of some state bars. And, inclusion in bar and professional organizations. The Oklahoma Bar has made some advances in that direction, but some state bars really don't have any committees on lawyers with disabilities. And so, students, like we were talking about earlier, are consistently discouraged from releasing this information if they have a choice. They get the message at school and at work that being a lawyer with a disability is a rare thing, and that it can be perceived by others as a sign of weakness or inferiority in the profession. People can make assumptions about your skill level, your energy level, your reliability. And the funny thing is that I want to wrap up in a minute to give you guys some time to ask some questions, but I asked the women how clients dealt with them, because that wasn't the point of the survey, but I could do surveys for the rest of my life on this topic, and I have so much data from this one, it was hard just to pull out one thread. And they said consistently that clients were more comfortable with them than their colleagues and judges were, which really is an indictment of the profession. It's an awful thing to say, especially if a lot of these women are working in disability-sensitive or disability rights organizations. One of my favorite attorneys, and I told the story when we had a faculty talk, was this woman who's in Georgia, who's African-American, who's a really successful solo practice, and she's blind. And she obviously pays her own accommodations because she's her own employer. She has a number of accommodations. She needs a driver, she needs a reader, she needs an assistant like anybody else would need. And so she has an entourage, really, of people at various times. She said that in her experience, her funniest story is that, the clients have been okay about it, haven't mentioned it. There have been two experiences that stuck out to her, and one of them I thought was particularly telling about clients and where they are when they come to us for legal services. She said she went through this nasty divorce or domestic relations situation with a client. A client never said anything about the fact that she was visibly blind. And then at the end, I was like, damn, I had a blind attorney. How did you do that? We suddenly had all these questions, like his blinders had been lifted in some way, and he suddenly saw his attorney and wondered how she had provided such good representation and how, technically she had done that. What do? Does somebody read things? So suddenly he had all these questions. But it was a revelation for him when his case was over that his attorney was blind. And he'd worked with her, it seemed like they had worked together for a very long time. And so you think this, maybe that would be the biggest barrier, that you would, firms and other employers will worry about how clients are going to react. But and the other clients hadn't really said anything, and he had a really amusing reaction. She said that when she goes to court, opposing counsel brings it up all the time as an issue and sort of implying that maybe we should disqualify this attorney. Judges will ask her very intrusive questions about how she exactly does her work, and she's going to be able to handle this case, and she has decades of experience. But she feels like, okay, maybe they're trying to ensure that the client will have competent representation. And so I will play along with that. That's okay. And I have the right answers to these questions. Just ask them again. Anytime she deals with a new attorney or a new judge, this comes up all the time, but not with clients. So it's very telling in that regard. I'm going to skip over this. That's my favorite attorney who's in Georgia. And was saying, she said that, because she has this triple experience of discrimination, she's disabled, she's a woman, she is African American. We were talking candidly about race and whether people get race more than they do disability. I don't want to set up this binary, like who's got it worse. We're not going to have misery poker or pity party. Just wanted to, talk to her about what is this experience like, because she kept bringing it up, and I thought, let's talk about it then. And so, what she says in this quote is, people, whether or not they get it, there's still many racist people out there, but whether or not people get race, they know they're not really supposed to talk about it. And so maybe they're more polite about it. But with disability, people feel like they can ask you any question that they want. And she said it's become so much more intrusive and invasive, especially as she's gotten older. She's seen people's attitudes about race improve. And she's really built her business in a minority community. And so she feels like people get that. But the disability thing doesn't matter if they're of your racial background or not. They feel like they can ask you all kinds of things. And so this really affected a lot of the women. They felt like they had internalized a lot of the marginalization that they experienced. I want to wrap up, and I'll give this about 5 minutes, with this quote from one of the women that I introduced at the beginning. She was the one who people had been worried that she would sue. She said, I think it's important that those of us who have enjoyed some level of success work towards ensuring that others can get there too. She said she could have used a role model, she could have used a mentor. There wasn't one there for her. It didn't have to be a person with her disability. It didn't have to be a person with disability at all. It didn't need to be a woman. It just needed to be someone to be an advocate or a sounding board. And she said she's more than willing to fill that role for another young woman, or a woman who's not so young, who's just graduated from law school. So she wants to help in some way. And that's consistently what I heard from the women who participated in the study. Even if they had really, really awful experiences, they wanted to do something to improve it for the next person. And, that was really, even with the stories of discrimination, and some of these interviews that went on for hours and covered everything from somebody's divorce and discrimination by their gynecologist, and in exam services, to being left outside of a workplace because it wasn't accessible and realizing they couldn't get in for their interview, or asking for time off to get mental health care and being mocked and ridiculed. In the end, there was a positive note in what people were willing to do for one another, and I think that's what it's going to take in the bar and also to educate employers, is to have this, and to have allies who don't have disabilities but have an interest in seeing the bar be more diverse and more sensitive to people with disabilities. So thanks so much. I'm willing to answer any questions, and I'll stay after. I know a lot of you have to get back to work, too. Thanks. Anybody have questions? Yeah. I didn't. And it's kind of weird. I didn't have anybody who, I didn't have anybody who's their employer. I had some people who initiate lawsuits against their law schools. A couple women who did that. They were younger women who tried to do it under the ADA and ultimately ended up mediating it in some way, resolving it, just because it was a game of attrition. They needed to continue on in law school, and they couldn't wait for a lawsuit to resolve everything. But the threat, and I filed a complaint against my law school. So I haven't filed a complaint against my employer, and nor do I intend to. I'd like tenure, and then I'll start suing everybody. No, but, that's also a myth out there that, a lot of people with disabilities are out there suing, and I think that a lot of people with disabilities don't believe the ADA has been strong enough, even though there's been some amendments to it recently. We'll see how that works out. Other questions? Thanks so much. You've been a good audience. I hope you were fed well. Take care. Happy holidays.